In the final part of this discussion, we will continue our talk with Wal Thornhill and Don Scott and discuss CMEs, solar flares, supernovas, and the evidence that underpins this model. Moving on to solar flares and CMEs. So obviously, solar flares, the classic explanation is that, there's some sort of a magnetic loop that blows out a certain amount of plasma from the sun. But if we were going back to an electric sun, what do we see solar flares being sort of an indication of in an electric sun model?
Well, I think you said it, and we observe it, so it's... I have to be like, who was it, Groucho Marx? Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes, But those CMEs, I agree with you. That's I think it's pretty well known that indeed, yes, those omega loops that form are simply the magnetic field. Maybe it's some of those subsurface currents that are going around in there. Then I think they are associated with sunspots, and the sunspots are associated with those omega loops. And so, it's all consistent. It's an electromagnetic process. I'll turn the question around. Get Carl Sagan in here and ask him, where in the heck does the magnetic field come from that creates those magnetic loops? And that the current does follow those magnetic loops, yes. And I just explained why, because it's the easiest path for them to take. There's less pushing and shoving, less. If the current goes in the same direction as the magnetic field, that's happy. It's like water running downhill. So sure, it's all electric.
I think one aspect of this is the origin of weather. Now, of course, we're happy, or at least we think we know how the weather systems on Earth are generated, but I would suggest that we don't, and that electrical input is very important. On the sun, of course, the electrical energy involved is that much stronger, and yet astronomers have admitted that the sun has weather. And so the CMEs and the solar flares can be seen as extreme storms on the sun. The sunspots are different in that I think Birkeland actually showed this phenomena of discharges from the plasma toroid, equatorial toroid, to the changing latitudes on the central sphere as the power input changes. And this ties in with the X-ray, variable X-ray output of the sun. The two go together. And so I think the sunspots themselves are where discharges from the energy, the electromagnetic energy stored in the plasma toroid, finally gets to a point where it has to discharge to the body itself, and it does so at varying latitudes depending on the energy. And when they do that, it actually punches through the photosphere. And the reason I say that is that the evidence comes from the umbral dots that you see in the dark area of the sunspot, which are typical of a discharge which has been pinched down in a more dense atmosphere. They're hotter and they're smaller. And this, of course, is a problem for astrophysicists because the umbral dots are not explained really, what is going on down there. Here we're seeing, in effect, another version of an electrical discharge, and it's not a tuft this time. It's an actual lightning discharge in the lower atmosphere of the sun.
Yeah. But if we go back to CMEs, then obviously if we assume that the CME is totally ejected, then one of the things which is maybe slightly going off topic here, but obviously is the whole concept of the electrical stressing of that star and what happens to the star as you increase those electrical stresses. And obviously it's the concept of the kind of fissioning where if you provide enough, it'll break into two spheres. May not be even size, but you get greater surface area. So I'm just wondering whether the CMEs are kind of an indication of some sort of an increased pulsing event or something internal to the star that causes it to generate a higher current density for a short period of time.
Yes, but I don't think anybody really knows. But the point you're making is really the basis of the start of Hannes Alfvén's work. Hannes Alfvén was an electrical engineer in Sweden. He was Swedish, of course, and they were having all sorts of explosions on their high voltage transmission lines in Sweden, because a lot of the power is generated in northern Sweden, but all the cities, Stockholm and Göteborg and all that, are in the south. So they have these high voltage transmission lines, and they were exploding. There was at the switches. Somebody would open a switch, and there'd be an arc that would. The electricity is saying to the human, "I don't care if you open a switch. I ain't stopping. I'm going right through." So you get this arc that forms. You can open the switch all you want, but then there's this arc, very much like a coronal, like an omega loop. And then
that's a good point, Don.
It breaks. That arc breaks, and then that was Hannes Alfvén's. I think the reason he got the Nobel Prize really was that he realized that there was energy stored in the magnetic field around those. I think at the time they were DC transmission lines.
That's right.
So it's a tremendous amount of energy in the magnetic field. Just like in an inductance, 1/2 Li squared, that's the energy in there. And when that thing breaks, the energy disappears. Well, where does it disappear? It flies off into space, bringing the plasma, which is part of the switch that didn't make it, and then it just blows it into space. So that was, that was the original beginning of Alfvén's work.
Yeah, one of the things about the pinch effect is that it can become so severe that it can actually open the circuit, and I think that's what happens in supernovae explosions and all of these sudden flaring, huge outbursts. And a CME may just be a small version of one of those, where a subsidiary circuit in the photosphere suddenly opens.
Yep.
And of course that's how it appears also, that suddenly this thing, instead of being closed, opens and just flings all the material that was in that circuit out into space.
But I'm guessing for me it's trying to understand and admittedly we probably don't have answers to all of these, but I'm trying to understand the mechanisms that would trigger that. So again, the analogy you give for the supernova is the fact that you then short-circuiting. I'm guessing in a supernova case, you're short-circuiting that pinch star with that outer heliosphere. All of a sudden, you have a massive discharge in both directions that just, bang goes the.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is actually short-circuiting the Birkeland current that's feeding that star, which is why the thing lights up as if it's almost equivalent to the light of the entire galaxy.
So rather than normally being a resistance load, you've removed the resistance, and now you've just got everything all at once. Boom.
Normally, the space plasma is so diffuse that it can't carry much current, and this is what limits the load of the star in the circuit. But if the star had a massive CME, for instance, and it's hurled material out in the equatorial plane, it could form the sudden increase in density, which would then pinch the Birkeland current down to the point where the outer cylinder came in at the star and just blew the whole thing to smithereens.
Yeah.
But certainly supernovae are not explained by current astrophysics. It's a desperate model, the idea that it implodes and then explodes. Even explosive experts say that the explosive rebound would not reach the surface.
Yeah, if I could add to it, I agree completely with everything Walt said. And the point I think that most people don't realize is, I lost my train of thought. You could keep talking. I'll interrupt again.
The final bit that I want to end on is really just talking about some of the evidence that we have so far. And I've actually made some additional notes. And this, I think, is something, because in my mind, what I want to try and do is, once I've kind of answered all of my questions, is to produce another version of, like Juergens' video, but then of the EU model, so the modified version of it, showing how that would work. And then maybe that would be one episode, and then there'd be an episode focusing on the evidence that underpins it, and then ending with a sapphire one that we'd already talked about doing anyway. But just in terms of what I have so far, I mean, obviously there is the paper that you sent on, which is about the Voyager and the dark electrons, which I think is, one piece of that sort of puzzle, looking at that. And there's also the other bits of evidence that you did in that video on the Voyager as well, which I think is worthwhile looking at, the bow shock. And I think you mentioned as well, Wal, that they're slowing down, the fact that it slowed down as they approached it, which then matches what you would see in that graph that we showed for the discharge tube. There's the Ulysses, in terms of that lovely spiral sort of current, and I guess to some extent you could talk about the slow and the fast solar wind, although that's not necessarily direct evidence, it's just a different explanation for it. Then there's the Parker Solar Probe, and some of the beautiful explanations of it made me chuckle when I read it, the magnetic switchback, which they refer to, the fact that as you go through, there are these magnetic switchbacks, which I think when you looked at it, Don, you refer to as the double layers. That's what you would expect to see.
Well, not necessarily. The magnetic switchbacks could be that they are actually traveling through the beginnings of a Birkeland current. If the Birkeland currents, let's say, feed the North Pole of the Earth, they start somewhere in the vicinity of the outer atmosphere of the sun, whether it's in the corona or we don't know. I don't know where it starts. But if you fly through a Birkeland current, sure, and you fly into and through the cross section of that thing, you're going to see magnetic fields go this way and then that way, and then this way and then that way and then this way and that. So it's all very reasonable.
Yeah, they keep seeing this kind of effect, and they call it turbulence.
Yeah. So my old senior brain fart stopped, and so the question I was going to ask that I think you, Gareth, should really pump in your work is, people ask Wal and me to explain this thing and that thing and the other thing, but I would like to turn the tables and ask astronomers, where does the corona come from? Why there's no corona around a nuclear reactor? There's no corona around my wood stove. The corona is an electrical effect, and do this with everything. Any question you can possibly ask Wal or me about the Juergens model or whatever. Electrons. Why are there electrons flying around out there? Up until a couple of years ago, there were a majority of astrophysicists said there could never be charge separation in space. They would all reunite and recombine and would disappear. There's no charges floating around out there.
On that point, now that you've said it, it kind of, in my mind, it sparked a question, which is, if we look at the electric sun model, then why is there a corona? I mean, I'm sort of turning it back on you. I mean, obviously, I've seen the graphs that show you that the fact that you've got an electric field that goes out, and then there is a kind of a point at which all those particles halt. But if we're saying that the heliopause sits, way further out than there, the virtual cathode, why do they stop there? What mechanism?
Well, Walt showed you that diagram of what a plasma discharge in a cylindrical tube in a laboratory would look like, with the polar column and all that. That's it. That's it.
So that's the positive column that you're looking at. The fact that you've got that first glow, and then it stops, and then further out you've got the cathode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the genius of Juergens came through. He recognized that was the situation, that the anode was the photosphere, the positive column was the corona, and the corona stops at about 3 or 5 solar radii out away from the sun, and the rest of it is in dark mode until you get out to what do they call it, the coronal dark space or something like that, which is the normal part of our heliosphere. Then eventually you get to the cathode. And the heliopause, or whatever you want to call it out there, is a virtual cathode. There's no sheet metal out there. It's where the electrons come from. So yeah, I mean, it's an analogy. It's a one-for-one analogy, and I think I know Wall thinks it fits very well.
Absolutely, yes. When you think about the old high voltage transmission lines, the DC ones, they used to discharge continually, coronal discharge. Yeah. And in that case, the electrons only got up to high velocities very close to the wire and began to induce ionization and the high energy effects that we see. And it's the same with the sun. It's a coronal discharge, really, in all its complexity.
It's like St. Elmo's fire on the masts of an old sailing ship. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with that, Gareth, but there is this thing.
It's an Elmo's fire, yeah.
It was a discharge, electrical discharge. And as Wall says, it's like within inches of the masthead, of the top of the mast. And it seems to be there was more coronal discharges on ships that had wooden masts than they had metal masts, and so it wasn't as conductive. So it was more of a static charge allowed up there. And that's what caused that discharge to happen. I used to have a sailboat. I never saw a
If only you did.
Just as well.
Well, I think there's a lot of those sorts of phenomena when you look at the weather, or the sprites and ball lightning, and again that all fits within that pattern. For me, it's easy to criticize one bit, but it's when you start looking at all of the evidence all together, and it's not necessarily that all of it's mapped out, because it isn't. It's one of these like growing mosaics where you're always expanding and adding and changing, but the concept that kind of makes sense, and it certainly resonates an awful lot with me, and it resonates with a lot of people. And you do see mainstream starting to use more and more of that sort of language, but obviously not quite. They're never going to do the full nod to the fact that they are. But it is, for me, it is about that bigger picture and trying to present that bigger picture and helping people to follow that journey to that understanding, because I think for some people it is life changing.
Yeah, I think that's valuable because reading Juergens' papers is hard work.
Yeah.
It's not obvious. You have to read it several times for it to begin to make sense, and then you have to do a lot of research yourself to understand all the phenomena that he's talking about.
Yeah.
You mentioned that diagram. Well, the one I always draw, the photospheric tuft and the double layer and the electric field and all that. I didn't really originate that. That was really the basic of it was in Juergens' paper. Now, I think he did a sort of a poor job. He had the thing reversed as far as an electrical engineer is concerned. We always draw the thing with the anode on the left and the cathode on the right, and the current going from left to right, that sort of thing. And he had it the opposite way around. No big deal. But it was him. It was Juergens who actually had that tuft shown as a. I don't know whether he talked about it.
I think he actually got it from someone else. There's another paper that he refers to in his paper.
Yeah, W.D. Ellis, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bruce?
No, it wasn't. No, Bruce was looking more at the sun as a lightning phenomena, atmospheric lightning phenomena. So it was he. I think was the inspiration for Juergens. Gave him the thought, can we look at this, and make sense of that? And that was where I think his analogies and that were, sheer brilliance.
Yep.
But Don certainly helped by pointing out that from the electrical engineering point of view, the tufts have a transistor action and control the output. And that is essential to explain why stars shine so steadily.
Well, it shows why the solar wind can shut off for 2 days, as it did. Was it 2009 or something like this? How do you shut off the solar wind? If this is strictly an atomic bomb slowly exploding in the middle of the sun, how do you shut it off for 2 days and then turn it back on again?
Yeah.
You pre-plan it 2 million years in advance.
Good pre-planning. Yes.
Yeah. And if it's due to the heat of the corona, I don't know that the corona got any cooler.
Right. Yeah.
I hope you've enjoyed the series exploring some of the detail of the electric sun. I intend to continue digging further into the details, as there are still many questions I have about this model, including the events that might lead up to the initiation of a star, how stars could split, and how planetary systems might have formed. I also intend to create separate videos that outline the complete model in one video, but there are still some stones that I need to unturn before I can do this. There will probably be smaller videos focusing on individual elements like solar flares, sunspots, and there may be more discussional videos to explore the details with the likes of Wol and Don and maybe even the Sapphire team. I would also like to say a big thank you to both Wol and Don for taking the time to sit down and talk with me and putting up with the endless stream of questions afterwards. Also, a massive thank you to all those that support this channel via PayPal or Patreon. Without your support, this journey would simply not be possible. Again, the full version of this conversation will be available to all of my Patreon supporters. As always, be brave, be curious, the truth is waiting for us. Until next time.